Welcome to this webinar where we discuss the analysis and outlook of the South American timber market. And this webinar is brought to you, as usual, by Timber Exchange, that is your partner in tracking global markets, finding global opportunities, automating your export processes, and now also outsourcing your trade finance and trade compliance. And this week's guest is Mr. Ryan Wolters of CMPC Madeiras. And now, without further ado, a warm welcome to Mr. Ryan Wolters. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Amir. Good seeing you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever people might be. Appreciate it. Here in Chile, it's morning, early, 9 o'clock in the morning. Europe, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So yeah, great to be here. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming. So how long have you been in the forestry industry and what is your role in CMPC?
Yeah, so this year marks my 18th year in the forestry industry. I'm right now holding the position of Vice President of Sales for CMPC Madeiras, the wood products division of CMPC. I look after sales, look after market intelligence, look after trading, look after product development, and we have sales offices in 3 countries outside of Chile as well: Germany, United States, and China. And well, I'm originally from Germany, half English, half German, married to a Chilean, right now living in Chile. Started out in the forestry industry 18 years ago selling paper. I was buying stock lots of paper and selling them to end users. Then I switched into the wood products industry and started selling some plywood, some lumber, and some millwork. I had a small detour for 2 years, more or less, selling pulp, bleached eucalyptus kraft pulp, some softwood pulp as well. And after 2 years, I decided to go back to the basics, back to the roots, and went back to the wood products division. And here I am in 2023.
Warm welcome back to the fun side of the business. That is also a bit more volatile.
For sure, for sure. It's a little bit more complex, with all due respect from our colleagues who are selling pulp. It's way more information, a little bit more SKUs than what you're used to in pulp.
So CMPC, how much do you produce and how many different markets are you active in?
Yeah, so if I'm just focusing on the wood products industry, we are actively marketing our products in around 40 countries worldwide on average, excluding some of the outliers, which are going to be spot sales, anything like this. In terms of production capacity, so we have 3 different business units. We have one business unit, which is the lumber production, lumber/timber production, depending on where you are and what kind of term you use, which is roughly around 900,000 cubic meters production per year. Then we have our millwork facilities, which are a value-added facility for our sawmills. So millwork, what I'm saying is going to be moldings and edge loop panels. This is what we understand as moldings. That's roughly around 190,000 cubic meters. And then we have a plywood business unit, which is around 500,000 cubic meters production per year. Having said that, in terms of the millwork, so all of our operations in terms of the wood product division up to last week were in Chile, but we recently announced an acquisition of a company in the United States, in the state of Kentucky, which is 2 manufacturing facilities for millwork. So that's going to add roughly around 30,000 cubic meters to our millwork capacity, going from 190 to a total of 220,000 per year.
Very impressive and not a small supply chain by any means. But can you please give us a context? How big is this in comparison to Chile's production overall, and how is that production capacity changing?
Yeah, sure. So it's a great question. So if you look a little bit more about Chile, so we have a total forest area of around 17 million hectares of forest, which is going to be between native forest, plantations, so on and so forth. If we just look at the plantations, we are roughly around 2.41 million hectares of plantations in Chile. And the output, for example, in terms of lumber production, the sawmill output is roughly around 8.7 million cubic meters. So if you look at us, which we are, let's make it easier, just 900,000. So we're only representing a relatively small share. Chile has a lot of different types of sawmills. We have roughly around 1,056 sawmills here in Chile. 90% of those have a production capacity which are below, let's call it 10, 15,000 cubic meters a year. So I don't want to call it necessarily mom and pop shop sawmills, but it's relatively small to medium sized. So you're going to be able to find sawmills here which are going to be producing from 500 cubic meters a month to 30,000, 35,000 a month. So you're going to find pretty much the whole range of sawmills in Chile or in terms of capacity. In terms of the output for panel production, which would encompass plywood, OSB, MDF, so on and so forth, this is roughly around 3.6 million cubic meters what Chile is producing as per today. And what has been changing, to answer the second part of your question, I think we're probably not that different than other markets. Actually, I do know we're not that different than other producing countries. Labor has been an issue and will continue to be an issue worldwide. I think COVID kind of put even more of a highlight to that. So automation, this is what has changed a lot here. We have been investing, we as CMPC, but also our competitors here in the market have been investing into automation in order to gain more efficiencies and compete with latest investments, as for example in Europe, you can see. That has been changing, and then the focus of the products being produced in Chile have been changing, and particularly on the lumber, but also on the panel side, where we have been going more towards value-added products. So we would consider value-added products on a lumber side could be something like thermally modified timber, could be structural timber, which is also treated with chemicals such as, for example, MCA, treated and kiln dried. In terms of plywood, could be water repellent plywood, for example. Those are some of the things what has been changing here in the industry in Chile.
But looking at the production capacity overall, would you say that it's increasing or decreasing?
It has been relatively stagnant. One of the reasons why it has been stagnant a little bit more has been relative to the raw material supply. So if you look a little bit, and I know I'm probably going to be going a little bit ahead of the questions, because later on in the webinar you're going to ask a question about this, but if you look a little bit more about this, it's been stable in terms of the sawmill. So one smaller to mid-size or medium-sized sawmill might close, another one might open. We have seen in particular throughout COVID, because demand was artificially high or artificially inflated a little bit more, so people were thinking about investing. But I'm sure some of the persons who are joining us on this call today can attest that probably also the investment costs have quite increased, because everything has increased in price points. So not too many investment. Main investment has been automation, so size of sawmills has been stagnant. And in terms of raw material supply, there's not much room to grow for independent sawmills or plywood mills, because they're buying logs on the open market. But I'll get into this a little bit later on.
So in your opinion, before we deep dive into market dynamics and the global markets overall, in your opinion, what makes Chile unique from a sawmilling perspective and a competitive global player?
Yeah, it's when I saw that question, trying to prepare for the webinar, I was thinking hard about it, and I don't want it to sound cheeky, the answer I'm going to give. But if you look worldwide, equipment is more or less the same cost. So, for example, we have in Chile, we have Link equipment, we have Soderham Ericsson, or they call themselves, I think, USNR nowadays. But so the equipment we have in Chile is very similar to the equipment you either find in North America, or you're going to be finding in Europe or in other parts of the world. So from that perspective, it's a matter of investment. But what makes us really unique in Chile is the raw material. So if you look at, for example, CMPC, we have pruned forests of radiata pine. There are not a lot of countries worldwide who have pruned forests and are able to offer clear lumber or clear plywood in the sheer magnitude CMPC or any other Chilean player who accounts for clear lumber. So that is definitely a factor which differentiates us. The other one is the talent and the people. Again, I can't stress enough that one of our biggest assets within our company at least, but also what I can see from our competition is really the talent and experienced teams. So we see our human capital as being the most important asset for us. What makes a difference? In sawmilling, it's all about cost and it's all about efficiencies. It is a commodity business in the majority of the cases. So it really boils down if you have a talented, experienced team mixed with the right equipment and then the raw material. But in our case, I'll make an example. I saw, I think it was Rich, who was coming from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So if I'm thinking about the US and I'm thinking about the area in Louisiana, or if I'm looking about the southeast of the US, so if you were to take an acre of, or acre, hectare, whatever you want to call it, of land, and you're going to plant radiata pine, like we do in Chile here, if you compare that with the same size in the southeast of the US, we can grow double as much volume in the same space as, for example, you would be able to do with a southern yellow pine, which would be in the southeast of the US. So we have an advantage in terms of our species. The other advantage in terms of the species is a little bit more the physical properties of the species. So if you look at this, we can get structural lumber out of our sideboards or out of our core lumber. For the Europeans, it would be something like in C24 and higher, what we can get out of it. Yeah, we get C16 as well. That is another advantage. If you look at the pallet industry, for example, one of the preferences is using radiata pine as a species because it's easy to work with, it's easy to nail, it's easy to cut, it's easy to sand. If you look at the millwork industry, for example, we're talking about clear lumber. One of the advantages for Chile and the species radiata pine itself is clearly that you're able to mill it. So if you're going to take a molding and better lumber and you're going to mill a solid lineal molding out of it, it's very easy to work with. It doesn't destroy your molders. As for example, other species which might have a little bit more pitch or resin in it, which does not have that much in radiata pine.
And you mentioned the raw material supply. So how is the raw material supply today? Because we've heard that there have been, unfortunately, devastating forest fires in Chile. Is this going to affect production in any way, or has it?
No, this question, Amir, this is something we have been getting, unfortunately, on a recurrent basis. It's not the first time this has happened. We had relatively big fires in 2016, end of 2016, beginning of 2017. So in our summer months, so when it's winter in Europe and North America, it's summer here in South America, so it's the opposite. So typically around the summer months, you're going to see this. So this year, we have had that question on a regular basis. Short-term interruptions for sure. In our case, we had 1 or 2 days where we weren't able to receive logs, but we had a log yard which was able to cover those 1 or 2 days where we weren't able to receive any of the logs. The majority of the things which were really affected here in Chile, and not only talking about CMPC, was that maybe the logs you needed to produce the products you had in the production already were not the logs you were getting. So for example, if you had to produce 16-foot lengths or 488 meters in lengths, but you were only able to get 4-meter lengths, those were some of the major complications we faced as an industry here, beginning of this year, February, March. In terms of your question, if this is going to affect the production going forward, for companies, and I mentioned this earlier, for companies such as CMPC or our competitor Arauco, we own our own forest and we have our own supply. So even though our forests as CMPC, but also Arauco, were affected, and obviously also smaller independent forestry owners, we are lucky that we won't be affected going forward for this, and we have not been really affected. However, we saw a good example in 2020, 2021, and 2022, or part of 2022. So we saw the ripple effects of the forest fires of 2016 and 2017. which took out quite some volume to supply. So one thing, obviously, if you have a forest fire and you're a forest owner, you might be able to at least cover your losses by getting paid by the insurance company, but you're going to lose that material. And that is something which we're seeing, that a lot of volume which was offered on the open market has been reduced. This was the effect of 2016, 2017, which we already saw in 2020 and 2021, where obviously the demand was not necessarily helping that factor. So we anticipate, and we don't have the numbers yet, exact numbers yet, Amir. I would have loved to share them. But we anticipate that this is going forward, is going to have some effect on some of the availability of logs being offered on the open market. We as CMPC, we continue to offer logs on the open market in order to support small and medium-sized company as much as we can, but obviously at the same time also making sure that this won't affect our own production. But in terms of CMPC, this is not going to be not going to be affected. I'm going to anticipate myself a question which might come later throughout the Q&A, but which fits right in here. So as we had forest fires, obviously we're going to have a couple of logs laying around which need to be consumed or which are able to be consumed, so burned logs. The industry has been consuming them relatively quickly once that has happened, once you were able to get back access into the forests. Reason being is you have on average probably up to 6 months before blue stain will form within the log itself. So you have to try and consume the burned logs before it hits the 7-month mark once that has happened. Otherwise you might face the risk of blue stain. In terms of CMPC, if we were to face anything like this going down the road, it's not necessarily a big issue, and for others as well, not as much, because we have a relatively big millwork industry here in Chile. So typically what you would do is you would use that material and send it off to the value added facilities such as the millwork plants, which are going to be finger joining them and priming them so you won't see any blue stain. It does not affect any of the material. They're still going to glue as well on the finger joint as they would if it would have come from a regular log. They're still going to be able to receive the primer on top of it. So this is something what we have been receiving in terms of questions a lot from our customer base worldwide. Obviously trying to look for a more economic alternative to regular lumber. But most likely the effects won't be really shared that much with the markets, because by the time it really should pop up, the majority of the volume is already going to be consumed in terms of burned logs, and the rest which is going to be remaining most likely is going to go into the millwork industry.
That's comforting to know. And on the topic of the forests, what size of the economical forests are? What's the ownership of the economical forests, and what's the size of them, and what percentage is owned by the large players?
Yeah. So I was mentioning earlier that the size of the plantations is roughly around 2.4. So you have 2.4 million hectares. Sorry. So for example, if you start looking at the plantations and you open it up a little bit more, you're going to see in terms of plantations two main species. You're going to see pine, which is radiata pine, and you're going to see eucalyptus. And eucalyptus is going to be two different species. It's going to be globulus and nitens. The eucalyptus is used for pulp production, 99.9%. There is some small production of eucalyptus lumber or other products here in Chile, but the majority is going to go. So if you look at a little bit more, you're going to have roughly around 1.3 million, 1.4 million hectares of radiata pine and 865,000 hectares of eucalyptus plantations split up between the two eucalyptus species I was mentioning earlier. CMPC and Arauco, more or less, which are the two main forestry owners here in Chile, account for 70% of ownership of the radiata pine plantations in Chile, so relatively big. Yeah, I think the other important thing to mention here, and goes back a little bit more towards changes you were asking earlier, so to the previous question as well. So if you look at radiata pine plantations here in Chile, you have radiata pine plantations as well in New Zealand, for example. So on average, we're cutting down logs for plywood is going to be around 24 years. Let's use that as an example. Eucalyptus is roughly around half, so 12 years for pulp. So a lot of the small, so the 30% remaining, a lot of the smaller forestry owners, what they have been doing is once they had cut down the pine, they have been replacing it with eucalyptus. Why? Because you can grow twice the volume in the same time as if you were to cut down pine. So one of the main issues what we're seeing is that the plantations of pine in Chile have been stagnant. This goes back to the comment I mentioned earlier. So apart from the forest fires, also the reason of why we project going forward for smaller and more independent sawmills, it might be more of a challenge to buy logs in the open market, is mainly related to, for example, stagnant plantations and the missing availability of logs due to any of the forest fires.
And jumping straight into the market, the biggest change, of course, over the past year has been of course, the unfortunate war in Ukraine. And some countries have taken a very heavy, very strong stance and sanctioned Russian timber. So have you, as CMPC, noticed an increase in inquiries where industrial importers want to replace Russian timber, for example, with Chilean? And if so, which markets do you think you can gain market share in?
Yeah, so it is not easy to differentiate, especially when looking when the unfortunate war started. It's really not easy to differentiate between what was related to overall demand because of COVID and the increase in demand, and what was related to the conflict between, or the war between Ukraine and Russia. However, so if I'm just looking at Chile, so we have seen a CAGR growth rate of around 88% of shipping lumber from Chile to Europe, in particular, for example, Spain, Italy. But it sounds nice, 88%. If you look at the cubic meter, it's a relatively small increase. The percentage looks bigger. On the lumber side, to be honest with you, we have not seen that much of an increase. However, on the plywood side, we have seen a humongous increase in demand and interest for a Chilean radiata pine plywood, substituting birch hardwood plywood or pine plywood coming from Russia. That is something we have seen in the US big time, and Europe as well, big time. In terms of lumber, not that much. The majority of the lumber and the increases in demand what we have seen has been in Europe, replacing some of the Russian timber which was going into Europe. Middle East, for example, which was also one of the bigger markets, the Russians are still getting to the Middle East actually quite well. They have still a lot of volume going there. Maybe not necessarily direct, maybe indirect through countries being exported like Georgia, Albania, any of the other countries. But no, not that much on lumber, but yes, indeed on plywood.
I can comment also on Russian lumber, because this is something that I try to track and as well myself, that there's a lot of congestion in Russian ports, and the logistics for them has become quite expensive, extremely expensive. And now with lower prices, in some areas of Russia, it just doesn't make sense to produce anymore. So overall for the market, for European players, North American players, and of course South American, it will be quite good actually, I believe. And but on the topic of uncertainty and war, there's so many negative things happening these days. War, higher energy costs, volatile prices, high inventories, rising interest rates. So what market dynamics are you tracking?
Yeah, so I would love to hear exactly what other people are tracking, just to see if we're doing the same or not, or if we're missing something. But so one of the things definitely what we're tracking is currencies. So in case, for example, of Chile, most of our production costs, pretty much almost all of our costs are in US dollars. So it doesn't matter what the Chilean peso against the US dollar does. The effect is relatively little on our costs. But there are other countries which are different. So looking at one of our neighbor countries, Brazil, for example, so we're tracking a lot of the currency, Brazilian real against US dollars, the euro against US dollars, because for example, if you're looking at some of the European sawmills, obviously their costs are going to be in euro, but we sell in US dollar, but we might sell also in euro. So that is something, inventories, for example, what you're doing at Timber Exchange, where you're tracking the inventories in ports. This is, for example, China. This is something what we really track a lot. This is probably one of our main items or dynamics what we're tracking, because we need to ensure that inventories are flowing, because that means that we can continue to sell, we can continue to operate and produce. We're looking at ocean freight rates, trucking freight rates, import-export statistics, housing starts, repair and remodeling indexes, consumer price indexes. That's really what we're doing. There's probably a lot more, to be honest with you, but I could probably continue talking 10 minutes about this. But those are some of the main ones what we're tracking as per today. And then obviously also if there are any kind of price indexes worldwide. So if you look at the wheat in Europe, if you look at the raisin in North America, those are some of the things, or the China bulletin, those are other dynamics. So the price evolution is another thing what we're tracking.
Yeah, I think tracking qualitative factors and quantitative factors has never been more important. 30, 40 years ago in this industry, if the price went up or down $5, that would be a huge piece of news in itself. And, economic cycles would take a decade to play out. Now we live in economic super cycles. Within a year, you can have a huge drop in increase, twice even if you're unlucky. So understanding how the supply chain is performing, local prices, inventories in the ports, trade flows going to this importing country, the stocks in the main supplying countries, and the production levels in these main supplying countries, building that and understanding that on top and complementing that with qualitative data and sentiment, I think that's the key going forward. Because today markets are so extremely interconnected, much more than before.
You're right. So it's something interesting. So we as a company, we have invested heavily in our market intelligence team over the last 3 years, but really heavily. And what I'm saying is not necessarily in adding persons to it, but in order to have the complete line, to not have the information in bits and pieces, but connecting the dots. Because as you were mentioning, it is relatively quick how the market dynamics are changing nowadays. And if you don't have the dots connected, you might not be able to take the right decision based on the information you have. So this is something what we have been doing a lot, where we have invested in technology in order to connect the different informations and dots, to then in turn interpret the data and see what are our next moves.
Really is important. And looking at global demand, Ryan, how do you see the demand supply situation today, and where are you seeing imbalances?
Yeah, so let me put out a disclaimer first, please. And it's something which obviously I have to discuss on a regular basis with my upper management, and I'm almost certain that part of the persons here participating in the webinar are going to face a very similar situation. We had extraordinary years, atypical years, 2020, 2021, and part of 2022. So if you're trying to compare 2023 to those same years, it's not going to go well. It's really not going to go well. So what we have been doing is we have been looking at pre-pandemic levels, which was 2019. So if you look at 2019 overall worldwide statistics in terms of sales, volumes, price points, 2023 is not that different. There might be a different component of markets, could be a little bit different than it was in 2019, but overall, business is comparably well if you compare it to 2019 in terms of volumes, in terms of prices. If you start comparing it to 2021, 2022, or 2020, you're going to be obviously with lower price points, lower demand, but you're going to be with higher cost. So this is something. So if we dive deep a little bit more, so I'm going to start off with Asia. So looking a little bit at Asia, China was probably one of the first markets in mid of 2022, which went downhill. I think that's the right way to put it, where you could really see demand going down. But it was also the first one to recover. While China in mid of 2020 went down in terms of demand point, Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asia were still going more or less strong. It hit them a little bit later, where demand where demand was hitting a break. Again, not that it went to a complete stop, zero, anything like this. It was just less than what you were used to in 2021 or beginning of 2022. So right now, what we're seeing is in Japan, for example, we continue to see an unbalanced inventory of lumber all over the country, which obviously is not making it necessarily an easy task to continue selling lumber into that particular market. But it's all about segmentation of customers and what segments are you pointing to, and what are you going to. So in our case, we have been lucky that we have been able to continue to sell lumber into Japan without any major interruptions. We do sell this in breakbulk vessels going to Japan. China, so up until probably the Chinese New Year, beginning of this year, demand was relatively moderate, stagnant. We have seen a slight rebound after Chinese New Year, but not the rebound we were expecting from usual years. Because if we start comparing, saying 2023 is like a 2019, so if 2019 typically you saw a relatively strong rebound after Chinese New Year's, because before Chinese New Year's they ask you to lower your shipments because they don't want to keep a lot of inventory if they're closed for a month or for weeks or whatever it might be. This year there was a small rebound, but not as much as expected. I think you could also see that a little bit more about the exports of logs coming from New Zealand and all the difficulties the guys in New Zealand are facing in exporting the logs, if this is the return price point or if this is the volume overall. So it is slowly but surely recovering. However, I believe now with the recent agreement between China and Australia, or more than an agreement, basically China lifting the ban on imports of Australian lumber into China, that might change a little bit. That might change a little bit more the market dynamics, and I think we're going to have to be very carefully looking of what that impact might be over the next couple of months and what ripple effects those impacts might have for other parts of the world. This is exactly, Amir, what I was talking earlier about, trying to connect the dots, because if there's more lumber coming in from Australia, it's going to replace somebody else. If that is the Russians, which have increased their exports, where are the Russians going to go now, for example? Or what happens to the South Americans? So those are the things which is for us very important to track and to observe in terms of dynamics. Southeast Asia, demand has been recovering. So Southeast Asia for me would be something like, let's call it Vietnam, Thailand, let's put Indonesia into it. Demand is recovering actually quite well. Reason being is we have seen a rebound in demand of millwork products for the US millwork market. And a lot of those countries are producing nowadays moldings or edged loop panels for those same markets. So if that market is getting a little bit stronger in terms of demand, where inventories were high and they finally went down, obviously that's going to trigger also the purchase of lumber or re-trigger the purchase of lumber. Central America, which is also one of the markets we are, one of our neighbor countries, which was a little bit more affected throughout the pandemic in terms of increase in freight costs. Their freight rates have gone down. In Chile, it was a little bit of freight increase during the pandemic. We at CMPC are very different than maybe the rest of the companies here in Chile. We have signed contracts with steamship lines, so we have a fixed rate. So we're not working with freight rates on the spot market, for example. We have fixed freight rates, but for example, our neighbor country, Brazil, they were heavily affected around 6 months ago when you could see that freight rates were getting more or less to what I would call not necessarily a normal level, but more of an acceptable level. We could see that they were getting back strong into different markets, and in particular into the packaging industry. and where Central America is relatively strong. So Central America would be something like Costa Rica, Guatemala, around there. This is something where we have seen for sure an imbalance between offer and demand. So there is more offer than demand. Part of that is resulting that China was a little bit less demand, and a lot of the Chilean mills have been exporting to China in the past. So they were rerouting the volumes to Central America. The US market, we don't play in lumber in the US market, or the lumber we are selling to the US market is non-dimensional lumber. It's mainly appearance grade lumber, and it's a relatively small volume, what we're doing. So, but I can talk to you in the US market or North America, better said, I can talk to you a little bit more about plywood. Demand has been relatively stable. Price points have been relatively stable. We have seen on the indexes, which are publicly available, that there were some ups and downs, but nothing noteworthy in terms of deviations on price points. But demand has been relatively stable so far. But we're going to have to see how the rest of this year plays out with the increase in the interest rates we have seen, in particular in the US, where a lot of the industry is really bound to the housing starts and repair and remodeling index. European market, probably towards the end of the year, which is very normal as it gets into the winter months, and obviously also based on the situation of how the European producers have been able to sell their production capacities. They have been a little bit more affected than what we have. This is my personal opinion. But we have seen a little bit more slowdown in demand towards the end of last year and beginning of this year in the winter months. But once it hit March, April, we actually saw a relatively nice rebound of demand. Prices have been declining, but again, they're still above pre-pandemic levels. So that is not that bad for us. The Chilean market itself, we have been affected. But again, it all comes and boils down to what is your customer base and what is the segmentation you're using, what are the segments you're trying to enter and you're playing in. So we were lucky enough that we have been playing in different segments. So if one was down, the other one was still relatively stable. But overall, I would say probably it's a stagnant market here in Chile for the time being. We're also in winter months right now, so it's typically not the best time in terms of demand point if you're looking at regular years. But we're expecting once it hits around September, October-ish, we're going to see rebound of demand, assuming there's not going to be any kind of recession. Which obviously, if you look at a little bit more at the World Bank, they're still projecting recessions towards Q3 of this year. So we're going to see how that all plays out. But again, I can't stress it enough. It's like, please don't compare yourself to the beautiful years our industry had, and which were really necessary for our industry over the last 2.5, 3 years. If you really compare yourself to 2018 and 2019, we're not doing bad, and demand is not doing that bad worldwide. It's not as beautiful as it was. You're going to have to really work to sell your products. You didn't have to work that much during the pandemic because most of the persons were more or less order takers as opposed to really doing a sales job. Now you just have to get used to selling again. That's pretty much how we see it.
Super, super interesting. So with all of this in mind, what is your view on the short term and medium term?
So short term, so let's call short term this year. I expect it to be a year full of challenges. Why am I saying challenges? So I was pointing to that a little bit earlier. Not all of the costs are yet going down. So if we're looking at more log costs, if we're looking at, for example, glue or primer, some of the chemical costs, they're still relatively high. They have not come down overall, even though part of the logistics or supply chain costs have come down. In our case, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of Chile, we were never that affected of such a huge increase. For example, as for what the Chinese were facing for exports going to Europe or the US market, Chile didn't face that. So that's one of the main issues. We're lucky enough here, and I mentioned this earlier, that in terms of our raw material costs, and raw material overall, we have the benefit that we are relatively competitive if we compare ourselves to North American producers or European producers. So we are able to continue running without having any negative effects in terms of our results. This is something positive for us, maybe not as positive for guys in North America and Europe. But if I look a little bit more at 2024 and 2025, we expect those markets or the markets worldwide to rebound and getting back. So if you look a little bit more, I think the US is an easy example to do. If you look at the housing starts, there is a huge pent-up demand. If you look at the inventory of houses you have in the US market and the age of the housings and what is needed for the population growth, if you compare that, there's a pent-up demand. And those houses, if this is single-family houses, multi-family houses, they're going to have to be built. They're going to have to be built. And they will be built at some point in time. So similar goes for other parts in the world. If you look a bit more at migration, so I was, the last time I was in Europe was in March of this year. So I was driving through different parts of Europe, Germany, Netherlands. You see some of the immigration and the migration which was happening because of the war in Ukraine and Russia. It's going to flip. So you're not going to have enough housing, for example, in Germany for all the persons who have migrated from Ukraine to Germany and who most likely will stay. So you're going to have to build more. But then if you look a little bit more about all of the changes, what we have seen over the last couple of years in terms of the mass timber industry. So a lot of times if you're looking at the total production capacity versus what is being sold on the open market, you're going to see there is a difference. So not necessarily everything which is being produced is also marketing on the open market. Look at what's happened with the mass timber industry and the CLT, cross-laminated timber, glulam. So a lot of the lumber nowadays is going into those end users, and those end users, they're getting benefits. So if I look at, for example, some regulations worldwide, Europe and France, or other parts of the world, where they're giving you benefits of building with renewable products, such as wood, there's going to be a continued push for using wood in the construction in the future, and this is going to spur and continue to spur the demand of lumber over the next couple of years. So that's why we, in our case, and we also do have a company which is producing cross-laminated timber here in Chile. This is something, for example, if you look at it more at the construction sector here in Chile, which has been down, we have not been affected. Why? Because building and wood is sexy. It is something which a lot of parts of the world on a governmental side are trying to support and encourage. And this is where a lot of our lumber is going to go to. And that's also one of the reasons, for example, why in Chile we have been focusing as an industry more and more about structural lumber production.
Super, super interesting. And it's a similar situation here in Sweden now, that normal housing construction has fallen significantly. But what's fallen even more is wooden housing construction. So many of the biggest political parties are actually discussing emergency measures to support the housing industry to continue, because we remember from the '08 crisis in the US that many people that were working in the housing and construction industry left. So by the time the economy rebound, those workers and those companies were no longer there. So in Sweden, this is something I believe, I know that the industry and the associations are lobbying very, very heavily for this. And I hope that at least in Sweden's case, which I'm tracking quite closely, that we will see some good news going forward, which will help and support the markets.
Yeah. So if you look at total Europe, so if you're looking at the Nordic countries, as you were just mentioning, like Sweden, Finland, Norway, it's roughly 80% of the whole housing construction is made out of wood. But if you're looking at total Europe nowadays, including all countries, you're roughly around 10% nowadays. And that's a huge increase from the last couple of years. So we are hopeful and very optimistic that this is going to help and push and also stabilize a little bit more going forward the industry. This is something we're definitely convinced of.
We will momentarily open the floor for Q&A, but before then we have two final questions. And we're discussing global trade and exports of timber or lumber. And of course, this wouldn't be possible without logistics. So how is the logistics situation in Chile? Are you seeing any bottlenecks and improvements?
Yeah, so this was a struggle not only for Chile, this was a struggle worldwide, especially throughout the pandemic. But so in terms of Chile, let's call it worldwide, there was an imbalance of empty containers because of the demand situation. So this led for us to have some issues on the availability of containers to export. We as a big company, together with other companies, we put ourselves together with the steamship lines and we hauled empty containers, for example, from the US back to Chile on a vessel. So it was a full vessel of empty containers going from the US to Chile, just to make sure that we can give the continuity and consistency to our customers, which they are used to in terms of supply. But yeah, so the problems have shifted. That's what I would probably say. So nowadays, container availability is not an issue. Transit times are not an issue. So transit times were heavily affected in the past because of huge congestions in transshipment ports. If this was either, I don't know, in Panama, where you can go then from there on towards, so from Chile towards Panama Canal, and then from Panama either go to North America or you go, for example, to Europe. This was heavily affected in the past. Or if you were going to the US, where you have another transshipment port, which would be in the Bahamas, Freeport, Bahamas, those were really heavily affected. Those congestions have, I wouldn't say they have completely vanished, but they're way more manageable nowadays than they were probably a year and a half ago, which is great in terms of container availability and less congestion in transshipment ports. However, there is still some congestion in transshipment ports. But the majority of the problems we're facing right now is in destination ports in terms of inventories. So for example, the US, that's a great example for us where we are facing challenges of bringing the containers into the US, into the ports. They're on the vessel, it's not a problem. They're going to be there in 24 to 28 days on average. But unloading it from the vessel and getting it into a warehouse is an issue. Why? Because, and if you look a little bit more at the situation, what we have been facing was that you had this huge problem in logistics worldwide, the supply chain worldwide. And people were ordering and ordering and ordering, and products weren't arriving, and boom, it was solved within, I wouldn't call it a day, but it was solved relatively quick. And all of a sudden, all the inventory which you were not expecting to arrive at one go, arrived in one go. And this is pretty much a situation for all products. If this is wood products, if this is plastics, consumer electronics, whatever it is. This was the same situation everywhere for every product and every part of the world. And this is some of the things we're still working through right now. So part of the problems we're seeing in some of the destination ports, for example, on the east coast of the US or in European ports, it's still that they are working through and warehousing space is less and less available, or it's less and less affordable depending on where you're going to be. So close to the ports, it's going to be a little bit more expensive as if you go further out. But then you can ship less because you might have weight restrictions. So majority of the problems right now is really inventories. Japan is another good example of it as well. But those are the main issues we're facing nowadays. It's not about container availability anymore. We can ship as much as we want out of it. It's not about lead times. They're going to arrive more or less in the time the steamship lines tell you they're going to take to ship those volumes to whatever destination it might be. But it's mainly inventories in destination ports. And again, it's not necessarily only wood products.
You've been in this industry for a long time and you're in charge of global sales and distribution. So technology has contributed a lot to production and automation, but we haven't seen so much automation in actual sales, global trade, supply chain management, and even less in customer service. So how do you think technology can contribute to a better customer satisfaction and working proactively and having a stronger supply chain?
It's a good question. So I think one of the positive effects highlighting COVID is probably the acceleration of some of those investments into digitalization. If this is on the supply chain side or any other part of the business, and I think in our wood industry and forest product industry, and I hope some of my colleagues who are joining here are going to be the same opinion, but we have been kind of in the Stone Age. It's probably exaggerating a little bit more, but we have been really behind other industries in the use of technology within our industry. And one of the things what we have seen, for example, throughout COVID was we had a small portion, in our case, I'm going to use the example of CMPC, we had a small portion where we still interchange paper bill of ladings. And this is something which we have changed to electronic bill of ladings. Simply because there was, for us, it was a very simple reason. If you had to send documents to a bank, but the bank was closed and couldn't receive the documents, you were kind of in a bind. You had a problem. So that kind of made you see. So what other alternatives are there? Oh, well, there's electronic documents. It's like, yes, they are. It's a great use. We have recently, a little bit over a year ago, we have started a different department within CMPC, which is a marketing customer centricity. And for example, in the customer centricity, where we want to put the customer in the center, one of the main focuses has been to the use of technology to improve customer service. So in our case, what we have been doing, for example, we call it FiberPlace, this is our own brand. It's very similar to what Timber Exchange is offering in terms of visibility. Really visibility is a big thing for us and a big thing for our customer service. Knowing where your products are, you can track them. We have partnered with companies who are able to help us doing GPS tracking of the vessels and the containers, so we have accurate information 24/7. And if this is, I don't know, if you want to look at it on an app on your Android phone or your iOS phone or on the website, your iPad, whatever you might have as a material to look at. Those are some of the things. But so electronic invoicing, this is something what we have continued to push strong, because also, so if you have a customer on the retail end, for example, electronic invoicing is something which customers are really appreciating, because if you're going to have 1,000 invoices a month and you have persons looking at 1,000 invoices a month, this can be quite painful. And obviously, trying to take out the human errors for this. Yeah, that's probably what I would say to this. I think we're in our industry, we're finally getting there. We're still missing a lot, but at least I think we had a good head start now through COVID, where we are forced to invest a little bit more in technology to improve customer service.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why I started Timber Exchange, actually, because I had shipments going all across the world, to North America, to Middle East and the MENA region, and also to the Far East. So I was working a lot, 24/7 essentially, and it was very, very hard to get an overview of how are my shipments progressing. And I had to manually chase the updates instead of letting the updates come to me and automatically sorting through what is most urgent and in what order do I need to deal with it. And that's essentially what it is, having updates that you need at your fingertips, but also providing that to your client, because you communicate with them over so many different channels, so that if they want to know where is the DHL, what's the, to see a copy of a document or a deadline, could be anything really, that they can easily log in their own language and find that information. So that when you speak to the client, you're not arguing, oh, I did tell you, or you have lost the information, the document which I sent you, because we have 100+ emails between us recently, so that when you're speaking to the client, you can focus on business and not on providing updates.
You're right. That's pretty much why we pushed hard, and the development and the FiberPlace tool I mentioned is a development which is pushed by our whole group of CMPC. So it involves all different business units. If this is going to be pulp, wood products, or our biopackaging unit, or our tissue unit, softies, this is something what we've been pushing as a group. And that's why also we had a lot of resources bundled. But this is exactly right what you're saying. If you're talking to a customer, you want to focus on business. You don't want to focus on, hey, can you give me an update where the order is? In our case, for example, one of the other things we put into this is it's really simple things like ordering samples, for example, that you can go, if you log in looking at your documents, oh, by the way, I also need some samples. So you're able to do this in one click, easy, without being too complicated. The technical data sheets, it's like, okay, what kind of MOE or MOR properties does radiata pine have? All those kind of things, so that customers can access this whenever they want, and they don't depend on their salesperson or their contact being available, who might just be on a call, on a plane, or whatever. Or it might be a difference of hours, where you are located in China, and typically we communicate with our Chinese customers in the evening of Chile or early in the morning of Chile. So yeah, no, definitely.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's been an absolute pleasure interviewing you. And now we enter the Q&A session. Let's see what questions we have. The first question is from Gabriella. How does the current market situation affect production/sales, and which measures were taken? I assume she means the Chilean perspective.
I would assume so. So in Chile, we had end of last year, probably beginning of this year, where some of the mills who went to more shifts than what they were used to in regular years went back to the shifts, pre-pandemic shifts. So how can I explain this easy? So let's make an example of a sawmill which usually was running one shift of production. They pre-pandemic, so 2019, 2020 or 2021, they might have gotten up to 2 shifts, and they went back down to 1 shift end of 2022, beginning of 2023. So there have been some effects where production has been curtailed, but you have to look at it, how was the production pre-pandemic, and not necessarily how was the production during the pandemic. So if you look at how it was pre-pandemic, it's not that different in terms of the production output pre-pandemic versus nowadays. So that has been for us one of the things how we were able to manage the current market situations. In our case, we're continuing to run 24/7, and we will continue to run 24/7 for sure. I think though one of the measures taken, so I think overall feedback is flexibility is the key. Flexibility in terms of sales, logistics, and production, because the market dynamics have been changing quite drastically and quite fast. So if you're looking at, for example, China, if you're looking at, let's call it 3 thicknesses in terms of lumber demand. You're going to be talking about 4/4, 5/4, 6/4, or 45 millimeter, 37 millimeter, 24 millimeter, to make it easy. Maybe the demand shifts from 1 month to the next month. Maybe there is more demand for 37 1 month, next demand is more for 24, next month is more for 45. There are other thicknesses, by the way, 50, 28, 32, 22, whatever. There are other thicknesses as well which are being sold on the market. But so this is one of the things what we have been doing is just, trying to be flexible in our operations and basing your production on what the market needs more than what your production is offering. Obviously, this might have ripple effects in terms of your efficiencies on your OEE or anything like this in your operations, but this is something you have to work together. So working together closely with operations. So I'll give you an example of myself. I'm every day working together with our chief operating officer. Every single day we're sitting together and looking at how is it progressing, so on and so forth. And that's not long you have to sit together. You don't have to sit together half a day for a meeting or anything like this. Could be calls. It's all about the routine and seeing and knowing. So it's really being able to adapt as quick as possible. That's the way you have to react. That's what we have done, and that's what the majority of the industry has done. So once you could see that the sideboard demand, so which is going into furniture end users or any decorative, went down, people were switching to selling more core lumber. So this is what we're doing. We're switching very much here in Chile, from not necessarily one day to the next day, but from weeks to weeks or months to months in terms of what is our offering. At least we try to do it as good as we can.
The next question is from Anna. Thank you both for a great webinar and valuable information. I might have missed earlier, what's the percentage of structural grade lumber reachable using radiata pine? And also, what are the standard dimensions being produced in Chile?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if Anna is from where Anna is located and asking a question, but so it's roughly around 70% you're going to be getting out, and it's going to be a mix of C16, C24 and higher. That's more or less, and I did not mention that, Anna, so you did not miss it. In terms of the standard dimensions, so we're relatively similar to the dimensions you're going to have in Europe in terms of structural lumber. It's pretty much the same dimensions what we're doing. But we're also doing this for US market. So if you're talking about a 45 millimeters of thickness, 42 millimeters of thickness, 38 or 37, we also do 35 millimeters. So 35 goes, for example, to Australia. 37, 38 goes to Central America or goes to North America. And then if you go up, you can go towards Europe. So we're relatively flexible in Chile in terms of the different sizes of what we're doing. Most of the production here in Chile is make to order. It is not necessary that it's made to stock and then you sell it, but it's made to order. So, for example, we're very different. We're probably closer to the Europeans than what we are to the North Americans in terms of how we produce and cut the logs. In North America, it's very common to have random widths and random lengths. We have fixed width and fixed lengths, and obviously fixed thicknesses. But we are able to vary in our thicknesses, width, and well, lengths not that much, but at least in width and in thicknesses. I hope I answered that question.
Anna is, I know Anna quite well. She's based in North America, and she said earlier in the chat she's based in Mobile, Alabama. And one thing I appreciate with Chilean lumber is also that you're able to produce quite thin boards as well. And
Yes.
why?
It's not something which I would probably say most of the sawmills do like to produce because it typically affects your efficiencies. But as long as you're getting compensated for that, sawmills are willing to do this. So 12, 13 millimeters going into, I don't know, packaging industry. If this is, I don't know, Middle East, Asia, Japan or South Korea or anything like this, yeah, that's also common. 60 millimeter, 17, 18.
Next question is from Bo. How many North American companies sold their timberlands? Or no, many North American companies sold their timberlands. Do you foresee CMPC making a similar decision?
No. No, not at all. It's one of our biggest assets we have. So it's a great question, because if you look a little bit more about what I was talking to you earlier, so North America, yeah, Weyerhaeuser is probably is the biggest landowner in North America. I'm almost certain they're the biggest landowner worldwide. I might be mistaken, so don't hold me for that last part of it. But so it's very different. Our forests are managed versus what you see in North America. They're not necessarily managed, so we're pruning them. For those of you who have not been to Chile, come to Chile, visit us. Great to receive you. Within the possibilities of receiving you, obviously competition is a different story. Our compliance department would need to get involved in those kind of things. But if you go through a forest in Chile, a plantation forest, you're going to see rows of trees, straight rows. It's very different from what if you go into a forest either in Europe or North America, where it is, I don't know if you want to call it natural forest, but it is a forest which is managed in a very different way than how we manage our forests in Chile.
And the final question is from Zigurdis. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Can 2x4 of radiata pine meet C24 stress grading?
Yes, it will depend on which part of the log the lumber is coming for the C24 for a 2x4. So you can get it from core lumber, but you can also get it from sideboards. But it also always depends on what is the density of the forest, where the forest is coming from. And this is one of the differences in our case, for example. We know exactly, we have mapped out all of our forests. We know what is the density, we know where's fast growth, we know what is the best end use of a forest for lumber, or if the best end use of the logs is going to go into the plywood. This is very much controlled in our case.
Very interesting. And that was actually the last question in the Q&A. So Ryan, big thank you indeed for coming on the show and telling us in depth and openly how you see the global market and how Chile is performing. And thank you, of course, to the audience as well. Thank you so much for coming week by week. I hope that there will be another webinar before the summer holidays. I have another special guest in mind, but cannot promise yet. Otherwise, I'll see you all again in August when we reopen. Thank you, everyone, for a great season. And thank you so much, Ryan, again. And hope to see you maybe in a year again so we can follow up how Chile is performing.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And if you have any questions for Ryan and would like to contact him, you can email me and I will forward your emails accordingly. Here are my contact details. Thank you again to everyone and have a great day. Bye-bye.